As you all probably know, we're big fans of the Grand Army of the Republic on this channel, and it's a fair bet that most of you are too. Among the many topics we've covered in our thorough analyses of the GAR and its clone soldiers were the Republic's clone commandos. In the past, we've talked a lot about how tremendously skilled the commandos were, and from all we've said about them, you might come to think these guys were just all-round extraordinary, good at pretty much everything. But that's never the case with anybody, and it certainly wasn't the case with clone commandos. In fact, there was actually one category in which commandos actually fared a whole lot worse than their normie brethren: fighting in full-scale battles. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at why.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
When Yoda arrived on Commando to take command of the Grand Army of the Republic in 22 BBY, he immediately took all available troops to Geonosis, intending to cripple the nascent Confederacy in a lightning strike attack. 192,000 clone troopers ended up landing on Geonosis, along with all 10,000 clone commandos. That first battle of the Clone Wars only lasted a few hours, but in that short amount of time, it saw more than its fair share of chaos. The Jedi who led the clone army in the battle were thoroughly unprepared for war, and their actions that day showed the clones as much. On the orders of General Windu, the Republic deployed all 10,000 of its clone commandos, representing the entire Special Operations Brigade. Some, like Delta Squad, were sent on espionage or sabotage missions, which ended up playing a crucial role in the Republic's eventual victory. The others were deployed in the field alongside the standard clone troopers, sent right to the front lines. 10,000 clone commandos charged into battle, and nearly half of them died. Clone commandos were supposed to be the best of the best, superior to their more common brethren, and yet they were absolutely slaughtered on Geonosis. Entire squads had been completely wiped out, and in total, 4,982 commandos fell, watering the planet's sands with their blood. This was nearly a 50% casualty rate, which is a far cry from what regular clone units suffered. The regs endured severe casualties for sure, but not anywhere near the devastating rates of the clone commandos. This led some in the Republic, especially strategically inept Jedi, to question whether or not clone commandos were really worth it at all. They were, of course, and the Republic was fortunate that people who knew that ultimately talked some sense into the Jedi. But the story of Geonosis still leaves us with a burning question. What the heck happened? The short answer is that clone commandos were commandos, not super soldiers. They were indeed some of the best clones in the army, with far more skill, better training, and better equipment than any clone trooper. Their armor came with low-strength personal energy shields, they had implants that allowed them to rapidly heal themselves mid-fight with Bacta dispensers, and their DC-17 interchangeable weapons systems could function as submachine guns, sniper rifles, and anti-tank armor weapons. These made them formidable in combat for sure, but not invincible. At the end of the day, clone commandos were trained primarily for covert missions. They were supposed to be sent out for espionage, sabotage, and other similar operations. They weren't supposed to be deployed as frontline troops. Geonosis showed exactly why quite clearly, as the commandos assigned to actual commando missions like Delta Squad fared far better than other squads. Their covert ops training made them incredibly tough, but it didn't prepare them whatsoever for fighting on open battlefields. And there are a number of ways that the frontline commandos on Geonosis were completely thrown for a loop by open war. First, there was the obvious issue of numbers. Clone commandos were used to being outgunned. After all, they were supposed to spend a lot of time behind enemy lines, where there would always be more of the enemy than there were clones. But covert ops typically provided commandos with ways to avoid fights, cover to make use of in battle, or some way to divide and conquer. Geonosis provided none of this. The frontline commandos ended up charging into a wall of battle droids, and the only way they knew how to deal with such a situation was to open fire and hope for the best. Unfortunately for many commandos, the best wasn't quite what they got. This leads into another, more obvious difference between what commandos were used to and what they had to face on Geonosis: terrain. The first Battle of Geonosis was largely fought on the large, open plains where the Confederacy set up its staging areas, which barely even had boulders for cover. Clone commandos were trained to avoid being that exposed, but on Geonosis, they had no choice and they struggled to compensate. They were trained to fight in relatively close quarters, not to fire on battle lines a few hundred meters away. But the biggest reason that clone commandos failed in open combat was that they just didn't work well in large groups. You've got to remember, clone commandos were raised and trained in squads of 4, and while these squads were formally sorted into larger units, they were next to never deployed that way. Commandos were taught to think of themselves and their brothers as pieces of a whole person, with that person being their squad. They were not, however, taught how that squad should fight alongside other units. Regular clone troopers were trained to fight as a collective. They were organized from birth into platoons of 36, and unlike commando squads, these platoons were expected to work flawlessly with each other. When the regular clones landed on Geonosis, they were, at first, just following the simulated battle plans the Kaminoans had taught them. The clone commandos didn't fit into this massive battle web at all, and they struggled to fight alongside regs or even alongside other commando squads. In turn, the clone troopers weren't prepared to fight alongside commandos. Their response to this unexpected development was to just sort of ignore it. They kept on fighting as they had been trained to fight, believing the commandos had their own plans. The commandos, as a result, were not only disoriented by the unfamiliar mission profile, but were also somewhat cut off from the rest of the GAR. The result was barely controlled chaos and a few thousand dead commandos. With the help of some more competent tacticians, the Jedi quickly came to see their colossal mistake at Geonosis for what it was, and they started deploying clone commandos properly after that. Mostly. After Geonosis, the surviving commando squads were deployed on covert missions to dozens of other worlds, where they did everything from sabotage droid factories, to steal separatist battle plans, to support local resistance movements. They fared much better on these missions, and the commandos never faced a bloodbath quite as bad as Geonosis again. With that said, the Jedi still wanted the super soldiers they wished the commandos had been, and they soon got their wish. After the first Battle of Commando, the Kaminoans deployed the first of the ARC troopers, a band of elite clones who were pretty much pure Jango Fett. ARC troopers, unlike clone commandos, were absolutely devastating on open battlefields, and they were also highly effective at command as well. They quickly replaced the clone commandos as the favorite brute force tool of some of the less competent Jedi generals, something the commandos were probably thankful for. Unfortunately, this didn't mean that clone commandos would never be misused again. There were quite a few instances of commando groups being deployed as rear guards in command centers, as was the case on Pre Sitlin, or in other roles that probably should have been filled by regs. Sometimes they were deployed for simple recon missions, which quite frankly was just a waste of resources. Those cases weren't nearly as bad as the Massacre of Geonosis, but those sorts of deployments weren't over for the commandos either. There was at least one major battlefield deployment of clone commandos during the Clone Wars, and it's one you've definitely heard of before. We don't know all that much about the later stages of the Battle of Sarish, aside from the obvious fact that the Republic lost, and that somewhere along the line, clone commando Gregor got knocked unconscious. Gregor, however, wasn't on Sarish alone, and he wasn't there with just a squad either. According to his personnel file, he was a captain, which meant that he would have been leading multiple squads on Sarish. From how Gregor described his last memories of the battle, he was fighting on an open battlefield when he was knocked out, which means the Battle of Sarish quite possibly ended the same way the Battle of Geonosis had begun, with the mass deployment of clone commandos as frontline soldiers. This was probably done out of desperation or to cover the retreat of the Republic's main attack force. So that's why clone commandos weren't actually all that great in battle, but what do you think? Would you like to see more of these tactical analysis videos in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before you run off to those suggested videos, guys, make sure you check out our all new channel, The Braved, where we post high quality content on a weekly basis that goes through all the eras of human history to handpick some of the most badass men and women existing in those eras. So if that sounds like it tickles your fancy, that's the first link in the description below. And if you just want to listen to some music, check out our Relax Jack channel, where we use a lot of the music posted there on the videos on this channel. And if you want access to exclusive content and a behind the scenes Discord where you can chat to myself and the team who make these videos, consider donating to the Patreon. And lastly, if you want to join our wider community, check us out in our Geetsly's Discord and our up and coming Geetsly's Gaming Network with our new Clone Wars roleplay server opening near the end of March. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.